Dr. Prabha Manuratne. I am indeed honored to have you here in my Atharamadhyava channel. Firstly, because you have been an academic I have been admiring for many long years, and I have used your work even for my doctoral research. And today, I've called you for a Debasa interview, particularly because I see the kind of unending relevance of a particular article that you did. It's called Kolambata Kiri, Apata Kakiri, Neoliberalism and the 1981 Education Reforms. And I mean, though you had written this somewhere in 2017, is it?
No, I think it's before that. Yeah, around that time.
Yes. So even now, even today, the things you have said make so much sense, even within the English teaching paradigm, especially within that. So that I thought it will be very important for people to listen to some of these things that you have said, especially when they are fighting their own feelings of inferiority or, you know, not being enough to feel bad about themselves, right? Which you have beautifully put in terms of how we have hidden the real problem and how we have given another gloss to these issues, which covers the responsibility of others who really should be handling this. And I thought that is exactly what will help some of the language learners realize of, you know, what has been happening. So before I do this interview, I would have given a single explanation of the essay, but let me just recap before I ask you the specific question. And you had said in this essay, Kolambata Kiri, Apata Kakiri is such a, for any Sinhala speaker, immediately we get what you mean. How, you know, always the people in urban areas, sadly, those who already have something, keep getting more resources available to them, and those areas with nothing and people who have very little are very often forgotten. In fact, very recently, I think I made this comment that we should all read this when I heard about a donation of a bus being given to one of the schools that is one of the best in this country. So, and I was thinking, you know, it hasn't stopped. I mean, you speak about it in 2007, 2017. I think in 1971, young people spoke of this. But here we are in 2022 doing the same thing. And you know, how much hasn't
even the power cuts work like that.
Sadly. And right now, both of us, it's 11:30 in the night. Yes. You know, and we are up here trying to somehow do this within all this, and we are like, it's amazing, and how little things change. So what I think is, Dr. Manuratne, maybe, you know, listening to the way, or realizing the way in which you have analyzed this will help in many forms, and particularly for me, English language teaching as well. So what you have, the 2 points that you make here is you say 2 things. One is that really it's the mismatch between education and employment, which is very often blamed for the crisis of education, is sustained by a deeper class antagonism, right? Yeah. That class actually lies beneath what we call the mismatch between employment and education. That's the first point you make. Secondly, is what you say, I argue that the proposed reforms mobilize policy and ideology to strengthen the discourse that the crisis in education and employment springs from youth dissatisfaction. And this is where I am really interested in what you say next, a discourse that turns a class-related crisis into one about expectations, affects, and personal failure. For me, that is crucial. Very often we put it back on the student when they don't get employed, when they don't, you know, get what they want to get, we put it back on personal failure. And I know, Dr. Manuratne, as I think you know, how much students can get affected by that. They think it's their fault, right? I'm not saying they're 100% not, but very often we turn social injustices
Into
for the
personal.
protection, yes, for the protection of those who actually don't do anything to change it, into personal failure, which is a very good way of stopping rebellion or protest, right? So that is for me a very important thing we should talk about and understand. And like question wise, I think I will ask you by telling you to give us a very quick introduction of what the 1981 education reforms were, Dr. Manuratne. So over to you.
Okay, thank you very much for having me on this show. And thank you also for that very perceptive reading of this essay. I was rereading this after years today because I had to do this interview and just sort of thinking back about the trajectory of how I got to write to this, to the point of writing this. Because that has its own history, and maybe I'll talk about that later. But the 1981 reforms, for me, these reforms were very personal. I was about 6 years old in 1981, around that time. I just started school, but I grew up in an environment where a lot of people around me were talking about this. So words like the Davala Patrika, you know, as you would probably remember, by the mid 1980s, this Davala Patrika was a big deal, right? And no one really knew what a Davala Patrika was, right? So there was always this talk of the Davala Patrika, this horrible Davala Patrika that has come, right? It's only years later that I even made the connection between the Davala Patrika and the white paper, what's called the white paper on education. So, you know, what was crucial about, I think, this 1981 white paper was, on the one hand, it was a kind of a rallying cry for people to oppose, especially young people, to oppose what was seen as a very unfair type of reform, right? So, and on the other hand, it was also one of the key reforms proposed by the J.R. Jayawardener government, which, as you know, after the landslide victory in 1977, by 1978, there was like a massive political reform as well as an economic reform. So I think this was the sort of the educational reform that was expected to follow what had happened at that point. And now in hindsight, I mean, we have catchy terms like neoliberalism today to describe this process. At the time, there was very little language to even describe what was going on, and it was understood in very empirical ways. So that's why I said, for me, it's like the way I understood these reforms in 1981 as a child was just as a sort of as a set of emotions where some people were very angry and other people thought, you know, now we are trying to change, now we are finally going to change. But as reforms themselves, and I have outlined a lot of this in my paper, so I'm not going to read too much out of the paper. But if you look at the actual paper, they are trying to deal with a few fundamental problems that they see in the education system at that point. And the problems that they see is tied on the one hand to what had, even by the early 1970s, had been recognized as this mismatch between education and employment. So there's a educational committee, reform committee, that is appointed somewhere in 1970, just before 71. Actually, it was called the Education Review Committee, and they begin to realize that there is a fundamental problem in this new education system now. As you know, if you sort of backtrack a little bit, you have the Kanagara reforms in the 1940s, in 43. And then you have the emergence of the Madhyam Mahavidyalaya system, as well as the schools teaching in the vernacular languages. So these two together form what we have come today to know as free education in our country.
Which made a huge impact on the population in Sri Lanka, opened up massive impact.
Massive, unimaginable kind of impact for a third world country.
Yes,
I think at that time, but even today, I think to sort of, I mean, if you think of the vision that went with that reform, I mean, it was a very controversial reform even at the time. Even the committee that proposed this, there's a lot of controversy. And for example, Sir Ivor James, very famously, kind of disagreed with some of the reforms. And I think there are many reasons why we should revisit that moment and look at, what worked out and what went wrong.
Right.
But
Manuratne, you make a point that now one thing which concerns language, especially, the problems that we are dealing with as language teachers, is that the vernacular languages were brought into education. That was again one of the impacts. Dr. Manuratne, is something I always wanted to ask, but even at that point, surely not all schools were English medium, right?
No. So there were vernacular schools. There were vernacular schools, and then there were these English medium schools. So if you look at the Kanangara reforms, I actually, if you have a minute, and if I can find it, maybe I'll read it for you in a second once I find it. So that's one of the bigger problems that the Kanangara reforms are trying to resolve, this problem of medium. Because vernacular education was given in Sinhala, but university education was in English.
Always.
Yeah, it was always in English.
Right.
So there is a break there between people having access to higher education in the Sinhala language, but also the kind of upward social mobility that was associated with education. I mean, this is common not just in Sri Lanka. I think in the entire South Indian continent, the Indian subcontinent, you find this. Sorry, the South Asian, the Indian subcontinent. You find that education is one of the key vehicles for upward social mobility. Right, so that the reason you got educated was for upward social mobility. I mean, we can impose like a lot of, and we can say that there are many noble reasons why people wanted education. And yes, there have always been people who wanted to be educated for the right and noble reasons, but it was also very pragmatic. There were very pragmatic reasons why people always wanted education. So you wanted to go up the social ladder. So anyway, to come back to the question of English and Sinhala, there were always vernacular languages that were teaching in the vernacular schools that were teaching in the vernacular languages. What the reforms actually did was to introduce the vernacular medium across the board. And some schools, I think a few schools maybe, tried to opt out of this, but the entire national system was restructured. So it's not just the fact that education was free. And in these vernacular schools, anyway, I think education was either like very, very much free, very close to free.
It was only the fee levying schools, which
schools that were expensive.
English. Yes, and those naturally only the elite could go anyway.
Yeah, this is what
yes, by putting this language thing, let's make education vernacular. Did those elite fee-levying schools also then turn into Sinhala?
They had to. They
right.
had to.
So that is why. Because I always wonder why there is so much anger for Bandaranaike for doing this. Because anyway, it was for a special group, not everybody.
No, it was all, so English education was always located in these few urban elite schools.
Yes,
but if you look at the sort of the social setup and the demographics of those schools, those are also the schools where the children of elite people went, the sort of the Colombo's elite, the Gaul elite, the Jaffna elite, the Candy elite, etc.
Yes.
Right. So that you had a few schools that were that attracted children from these families. So it was very much so the school was very much a place for connections. You see this to this day, Madhu.
Absolutely. Right? No, I completely agree. What I'm trying to understand, Dr. Manuratne, is why there are many people who say it's because of the 1956 education reforms that English was, taken away from the grasp of many people. But that is not quite the case, is it? Because it never was within the grasp of many people anyway. It was only the elite who then was.
Yeah, it was, yes. It was the elite that was, at least at the school level.
At the school level.
It was only in the elite schools that you had this kind of English medium education. So if you look at biographies from people from this era, you have, I was recently reading a biography. I just heard about this actually. You know, like in the 1960s, how, you know, suddenly people went from going to English medium schools, like, you know, schools that were associated with the church, right? So mission schools, certain Buddhist schools, you know, the sort of the, so these schools already had English medium, and there were many, many vernacular schools that were in Sinhala. Now in 1963, there is a very interesting conversation happening among vernacular teachers, right? And this is coming at a teachers congress. I found this in a newspaper actually. So the conversation is, what do we need to do to give our students education in the vernacular languages that will be on par with what is given by the English medium, right? So part of the English medium schools, part of the conversation is that English medium teachers are getting paid more than vernacular Sinhala and Tamil medium teachers.
And that's right? True. Even though the government paid, there were two rates for the.
There were two rates. Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
So there is this big conversation happening in 1963, and part of the question there, so part of the demand is that you have to pay everybody the same, right? But the other side of the question is, so these teachers are also asking, you know, what do you want from us? If you give us the opportunity, we can produce students studying mathematics, for example, in Sinhala medium, who will be just as good as those who are studying in English medium, right? So to sort of level out the difference between English medium education and Sinhala medium education, right? So it's very much tied to language. I mean, as you know, Madhu, the class structure in our country is very much based on language, right? It's deeply not based, but it's deep intertwined with language. To this day, the sign of belonging to the elite it depends on the kind of accent that you have. When you think about it, I mean, after 70 odd years of independence, it's ridiculous that people still claim that they either speak the Queen's English or at least claim that only standard Sri Lankan English is the proper version of English. And there's sort of like so many language related markers of class that are active to this day. So it's very much tied to how class works. So to come back to the article and what I was trying to get at is that by 1970-71, these in some ways at the school level, education is turned into the vernacular language. I remember even in the education at the university level, Kelaniya and Sri Jayawardenepura, Vidyodaya and Vidyalankara universities were established as vernacular universities.
Absolutely, and there was a movement behind it when the Pirivan were converted when the huge Buddhist movement was part of that. Yes.
Yeah. So it's very interesting because these two universities are so there's the proper university, and then they're called the Pirivana universities essentially.
They must have been, not anymore. Funnily, Prabha, you and I represent both of those.
Exactly. So it's really interesting because even by the 1970s, I did another paper on a 1975 report of a ragging incident at Kelaniya University, and you can see that when people talk about it, people still associate Kelaniya, and you call the Vidyalankara campus at the time, still with the old Pirivana. So even by the 60s, so there's a real cultural clash going on here, which I think has played out in some ways, in very tragic ways in our political and educational history. It's kind of beyond what we're talking about today, but it has had many different consequences, sad and happy, I suppose. I mean, there are two sides to everything, but mostly, I mean, it's quite tragic the way things have played out, the way...
Dr. Prabha, just, I'm getting back to it. So, though the education system admitted native language, vernacular languages into the school system, till the two Piriven were turned into universities, the tertiary education remained English.
No, it was that year.
Simultaneous. Okay,
Yeah,
so it was simultaneous.
Yeah,
so there was a mobility,
50s.
right?
Yeah.
Because
your
mention is like a beautiful. You have said we opened up here, and it was ironically the very success created the bottleneck up here
at the university level.
Absolutely, like when they passed out, all that Aravasiya, the profit that opening out education meant to people actually caused enormous problems, because after they passed out, the employment opportunities were not similar. And secondly, you say, though it was opened out to everyone, the arts people, the sector that got most of the underprivileged classes was arts. And that the streams that led to good, higher employment opportunities remained with the traditional elite people anyway. So I find it actually it's quite eye-opening for me to realize that though we celebrate the Kannangara reforms, the equivalent developments that were needed to make it really successful did not happen. And perhaps that is the tragedy that you were going to refer to, Dr. Prabha?
Yeah, that's part of it. I mean, I quote Dr. Jayadeva Uyangode in my article on this, and he says it was a kind of a one-way ticket. Like there was a lot of promise in the Kannangara reforms. And I'm not saying this as someone who is against or critical of Kannangara reforms. I believe that it is one of the best things that were, I mean, for all its shortcomings, it could have been better planned. We could have done things much better, but even in the way that it was done, I think it's one of the smartest moves that a third world country could have made. I'm not saying this as a criticism of the Kannangara reforms, and I'm someone who has sort of very actively been, for free education and for the values that the Kannangara report represents, or the reforms represent. But we also have to be able to see the complications and the paradoxes associated with such a massive reform. So I quote Dr. Professor Jayadeva Uyangode in this article, who says that it is a kind of a one-way ticket. Like you have this promise to this prosperity, as it were, but it's something that could not be delivered because on the one hand, so in 1970, they are already beginning to talk about vocationalization. Right? So that 1970s review committee, education review committee, is already talking about vocationalization, because you don't know now what to do with these vernacular educated arts graduates. Like what they've been doing is absorbing these people into the state sector.
And Dr. Manuratne, that is also dangerous, no? Because suddenly the unemployed sector were very intelligent, educated people.
Yeah, which is the case.
I remember when Navana used this line, the most dangerous link is created by poverty linking with intellect and education. So
because you're educated and you have these aspirations, but you and then also back in the 60s and the 70s, we also have to remember there was a very strong left movement in this country, a very strong students movement in this country. These are all very, very real frameworks that affected people.
Would the 1971 insurrection be directly linked to this, Dr. Manuratne, do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, many many people who have commented on this, starting with people like Kalina Debasak, people who have written about the 1971, link it directly to the problem of the shift to the vernacular languages as well as free education. There you suddenly had people who have never had access, people from classes that never had access to the privileged university education coming into the universities. There's a very interesting 1964, I want to say, report, 64, 62 or 64, about what is wrong with the university system, right? You know, from time to time that these various commissions are trying to figure out what is wrong with our system. And the exasperation, they're like, what are these people doing in the university? So it's a completely for very traditional, conservative, traditional minded people. They are shocked that these people who were never expected to be here are here. I think it's a great thing that is possible in a country. But then
who was allowed to say that and get away with it, Dr. Prabha, at that point?
In the 60s, I think it is quite possible. It's a report. I mean, I can send you the links. I didn't prepare as much to talk about the other reports, but it's really interesting the way they talk about Kelaniya, the Vidyalankara campus, for example, and everything that is wrong with it. You can tell that it's coming from a very conservative, proper English educated people saying these things. It's really interesting that that's how this shift was seen. And unfortunately, on the one hand, so it led to the paradoxes that were at the heart, I think, of 71 and also 87 and 89, the southern uprisings, as well as to some extent the northern uprising as well.
With the standardization issue, no? With the standardization issue.
That's the 72 standardization issue. There this sense of disillusionment and anger was, unfortunately, I was a very short-sighted resolve a problem. It was racialized, right? So the experience of disillusionment expressed by the youth in the South is kind of because racializing. It's just a bad policy move. There are people say Tamil language people, Tamil medium people were scoring better. So they sort of created this standardization, which then was hugely unfair by Tamil students. Right? So that's another type of, what we've been trying to do, I think, is not to recognize the way that the class system, as a post-colonial society, I don't think we've really faced the realities of our class system properly. We're not, I mean, everybody talks about class, but I'm not sure that we've really acknowledged the paradoxes that are tied to how class works in this country. So I'm not talking about a simple sort of capitalist versus proletariat kind of system. It's not simplistic, and this is why I bring in Newton Gunasingh into my discussion to talk about the rural petit bourgeois and the urban petit bourgeois class. This small the middle class, the lower middle classes, and the rural middle classes. Extremely important class in our political landscape, especially now. Which had from 56 onwards had a very crucial presence in the way policy reforms were made. Even the 56 reforms were tied to the aspirations of this class.
Correct.
There are many problems, good things, but also problems into those reforms. And so this is why, I don't think it's unfair to say that the 56, the language, single-only language policy and the language medium, the reforms, everything, that those changes created the ethnic war, and it sort of intensified. it would have come either way, because I think there was a lot of inequality in our country.
But the first riots were linked to the language issue in
It's
56 and
it
58.
turned language,
So,
essentially weaponized language, as a
exactly.
political tool.
Absolutely, and as an English language teacher, Dr. Manuratne, I think I more than you, because you're in the English department per se. I'm in the Department of English Language Teaching, and they are more than ever. You see the complications of class, and it's never simple. It's never straightforward. So I see that, and I like what you have pointed out here. We were talking about the vocationalization in the 70s, and then you say it's very interesting. It happened once in the 70s, once in the 80s, but there was a crucial difference. In the 70s, they were trying to make the state system absorb these students, but by the 80s, they were trying to give these people soft skills, so-called, to put them into the private sector, right? What had happened in the interim, Dr. Manuratne, for that change, for us to forget that the state
JR had come to power. That's the thing. It's quite, because also it's not as simple as that, but I think JR's political emergence as the executive president really is representative of the neoliberalization of our economy and our political system completely. So in the 70s, what you have is people saying you need people who have vocational training, who can contribute towards national development, right? Understood in very state terms. Whereas, like as you rightly pointed out, what happens after 77 and 78, if you remember, is that there is the economic liberalization and the shift, the structural adjustments that were introduced by the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. And this is not just in Sri Lanka; it happened across the globe. There was a massive debt crisis. The state capitalist system, the sort of what we call the welfare state, across the world was struggling. It was very difficult. And you have figures like Margaret Thatcher coming in the UK, Ronald Reagan, and these three big figures.
Yes. Dr. Manuratne, was the welfare system across the world?
Yes. If you look at the 60s and the 70s, what we call state capitalism, or this Keynesian model of the welfare system. It goes back to the 1930s US, the New Deal. The emerge in the 1930s, the emergence of the rights gained by the European working classes, and then by the 1960s and the 70s, particularly. There is the newly independent states. Many countries were borrowing money to industrialize themselves, but it was always centered on the state. It was the states that were borrowing. This is why the debt crisis came. The debt crisis came because the states had borrowed, and then they couldn't pay back. There was a dollar devaluation. A lot of things are happening. It was a really interesting decade.
Because when Margaret Thatcher is acutely disliked for, I think, doing what JR did here.
Yeah, absolutely. And she's the one who said there is no alternative now, and there is no society. Like these sort of wild claims for the 1970s,
Right.
And Ronald Reagan. We must not forget Reagan, the other big figure who just slashed the social security network in the United States in the early 1980s. Right. It's massive.
Right. So it's a global trend. I actually had not. So for some reason, I had not remembered that US and UK a little bit, yes, but US being a welfare society,
welfare in the sense, it's not a socialist state, but there's a lot of welfare. The social security network is quite strong up to the early to mid 70s in the US, and then that's when it begins to shift.
Is that the time then that the World Bank and the IMF have a stronghold, because even now, Dr. Manuratne, you know how much we are dealing with policy and qualitative statements that the World Bank asked for. Was that the time that they became all powerful, the 60s and
70s? No, it was really in the, so the World Bank had been formed in the 1940s, I think, but it had just been there as a sort of a global institution. What happened in the 70s was that a lot of third world countries went into debt after the dollar devaluation, somewhere in 74. I'm sorry, I am just sort of very hazy. The years are very hazy in my head. But the mid 1970s, there was a massive dollar devaluation. The oil countries, the emergence. So there were a lot of economic changes, but the countries, the third world countries like Mexico, for example, who had borrowed extensively, and certain African countries and Asian countries who had borrowed extensively from Western banks for state-centered development in the third world. Essentially, they went bankrupt, they went into debt, they couldn't pay the debts back. So that's when the IMF stepped in on their behalf and said, okay, we will manage the debt, but you have to implement what they call structural adjustment programs. They're called SAPs, right? So structural adjustment programs across the world demanded that the economies be opened up, just like our economic liberalization, and they put certain conditions. And one of the conditions is the shrinking of the state welfare system. So this is the sort of the history. So the 81 reforms are tied to this history. I don't think it's possible to think about the 81 reforms that were produced outside of this, because in somewhere in 1975, that was one of the earliest experiments of trying to neoliberalize education. David Harvey talks about this in his book about neoliberalism in the New York city school system, very interestingly. And when they tried it in Chile, the whole Chilean coup was this, it was tied to this this big experiment that the Milton Friedmans of the world were doing. You know, this what we now call it the neoconservative agenda, which had, like, a lot of people in the 60s thought, you know, they were mad, they were crazy to think that you could limit the state in this way. By the 80s, it was just
it was opposite field, that now it's considered mad. It's exactly.
Yeah, now it's the other way around.
Yes, the other way around.
State can handle things, exactly.
Yes.
So this is why the IMF, and this is the antipathy. This is why to this day people are like, there's a lot of antipathy towards World Bank sponsored reforms. There's a lot of suspicion because in the 80s, and I think it's a legitimate suspicion. I think we should be suspicious of anybody who's too nice to us if we can afford to be suspicious like that. But in the 1980s, it was quite clear that the state was, and interestingly, I don't think Sri Lanka was in that much debt even at this time. So it was not like we were struggling like today. You know, we didn't have this kind of crisis, but anyway, J.R. Jayawardena went ahead with the reforms, and then the foreign direct investments.
Did he ever have a choice, Dr. Manuratne? If, as you say, we were.
I don't know. I don't know enough about the political.
Yeah, because I always feel though we have pretty words and all that, you know, all that jazz.
Yeah.
Sometimes countries like ours, maybe there really is no choice. We are so caught in. We have other cups being laid now, but it's not relevant to what we are discussing. But I always feel, you know,
it's like this.
Yeah,
it's like this. I mean, now today, if I think we are desperate to a point where we can't say no to the IMF anymore. I think there were countries let me put it this way. I think there were countries in the world at the time who were so desperate that they could do nothing but do whatever the IMF said. I don't think Sri Lanka was that desperate.
Yes.
But politically, I think J.R. Jayawardena wanted to align himself with this emerging new the emerging world order, as it were. So it's quite clear that it's also his attitude, to things as an individual, as a leader, as a national leader. It's quite clear. I mean, his sort of expressions of power, the fact that they took on the executive, that he took the executive presidency. So I think it is a mix of both. I think there would have been a certain level of reform that had to be done, given the state of the Sri Lankan economy at this time, as well as a lot of stagnation. The 70s was a tough decade for any ruler. It was a very difficult decade. And so I don't know. I mean, I don't know enough about, the situation.
Yes, 81 education reforms were very much part of this desire to change, right?
Yes.
And Dr. Manuratne, were they, this white paper, I mean, was it ever passed finally? Did it become an act? And did this, let's go back to the introduction. What were they trying to change with these reforms?
So they were trying to change the structure of the school system and the entire education system, actually. So I talk about this, remember some of this. So whether these were actually ever passed, as far as I can tell, and I'm not an expert on policy, so forgive me if I'm not quite clear on this. I think what happened was these reforms were introduced piecemeal, part by part, right, little by little. I don't think it was passed completely, right, because there was a lot of opposition to different parts of this. And so if you remember in 1988, that 1 year, this system that was proposed was actually put into practice. There was a grade 8 O-level exam. I don't know if you know about this. This is a strange delayed grade 8 O-level exam that had these continuous assessments and all. It was
I do. I was doing my A-levels in 88, and there was
this odd 1 year of this exam that they're talking about, and then it just disappeared. So I was younger, so I did my O-levels later, but I remember that there was that one exam, right? And but there was a lot of opposition to the exam, to the Dawala Patrikawa, as it was called. And this line that I use, Kolambata Kiri, Apata Kakiri, is a slogan. You could see it on walls, written on walls, and it was a slogan that was chanted by school children quite a bit.
What exactly were the reforms they were asking for, Dr. Manuratne?
So here, for example, these are the problems they were trying. I'll just refer to my article here.
Yes.
This is on page 17. So there were certain central problems that they were trying to solve. The disparity among government schools leading to intense competition between them. Right? So we had already by the 80s created a set of government schools that had access to resources, and then there was intense competition. And within the schools, within the system, there was a lot of over-competition, which is still our problem.
I was thinking all those four were absolutely valid then and still valid. Yes.
So results-oriented, exam-oriented education, and also the over-reliance on written examinations and the inefficiency within the teaching service.
Right.
So I think, even 30, 40 years later, we are struggling with the same problem.
So why was there objection to that? Because that list seemed pretty solid or valid.
I mean, I was reading through this today and I was thinking, by today's standards, this is actually quite okay.
My feelings exactly. Why did we protest that?
I think partly it was because there was this, it was the rhetoric, I think, that came with this. The idea that this is trying to privatize education. I think to this day, that people are very suspicious of attempts to privatize education, and the sort of the JVP. I mean, let's just be honest about this. This has always been one of the key rallying points. Excuse me. especially in the 80s, the JVP insurrection, and the one part was about provision, the councils and the devolution of power. The other side was education. So I think part of it is that the sort of the fear that this is an attempt to private. There was a lot that was being privatized at the time.
Okay.
At the time, so there was a lot of opposition and a lot of fear to that kind of privatization. Right, a fear of that kind of privatization, and I think it's the fear that this was a sort of a roundabout way, and the way people understood this was through the if you remember the North Colombo Private Medical College, the PMC,
yes.
which eventually became the Ragama Medical College, attached to my the tiny university now. So that was a private medical college, right? So I think, particularly when they try to touch medical education, for a lot of people,
which we saw even recently. Yes.
Yeah. In fact, when I was writing this article, I was writing this at the time that anti-Saigon protests were happening. So I was returning to this early moment to understand what was going on at the time. So that even to this day, I mean, even Saigon, they never really could push it through. No? Yes. So it's very difficult.
Yeah, we don't seem to have got out of the cycle of the same problems. That's
not at all. This is what history does to you. You realize, my gosh, these are still the problems they are trying to solve. So some of the things that it tried to do was, I mean, if you sort of read this, it's quite actually naive, in the sense that it was trying to make the teaching service more efficient. It was trying to make the schools more self-reliant. So in the abstract, these are all great. And it was also trying to introduce more vocational education. It was trying to stratify, as it were, this sort of meritocracy that we have created. I don't talk about that a lot in this article, but since writing this, I've been thinking about our meritocratic system, where we always reward the people who are the best, and that there is no backup plan for everyone else. You know, we created this system. So, but these reforms were really sort of trying to find, lateral entry points into the education system to get students to understand their strengths. You know, this grade 8 exam, for example, was meant to help students decide whether they wanted to go into vocational training or whether they wanted to get into academic training, right? So in theory, it seems like a good idea. And in theory, I think when you're doing policy, you would propose things like this. But for me, I think the opposition came because it was viewed with a lot of suspicion. Davala Patrika, for me, the way I had heard about it in the 80s was always about this sort of very bad thing that was going to deny and deprive people, ordinary people, of education. I think it's very much tied to the rhetoric, the class.
Manuratne, you bring into the conversation a Wendy Brown, whose ideas puts a lot of sense into what you're analyzing. Why did you put that theorist into it? Was it very relevant to? It has nothing to do with Sri Lanka, I'm assuming. Yes.
No. It had nothing to do with Sri Lanka. Yeah. She is talking about the neo-liberalization of higher education in the US.
In the US.
Yeah. In the US, and at the time that article was written, I think it came out maybe 2015 or 2016, around that time. You know, they had really started struggling with the slashes, particularly to arts education. So there's a lot of the problems were very tangible. I don't think it has reached us yet because we still have the state universities.
Yes,
but in the US, it's quite stark. It was quite stark. And so what Wendy Brown is trying to understand is how neoliberalism really creates this other understanding of the self, and she's particularly talking about universities. And she says the reason I picked this source is for two reasons. One is, she says that what neoliberalism does is that it it economizes all aspects of our lives, including ourselves. We begin to think of ourselves as something to be invested, as a kind of an investment, right? It's a beautiful word that she uses. She turns that it turns us into specks of capital, like a little speck of capital.
Yes.
Right? So I think that's so for me. I think 81 represents that shift in the discourse. It was not so much the policy that the policy was introduced too, like bit by bit, in bits and pieces. So but it was not just the policy; it was also the rhetoric of this neoliberal rhetoric of you need to invest in yourself. It's your responsibility. It's up to you. Sort
right.
of,
and you have used two words. One was, which she has said, responsibilization, which I think is a new word for me, but absolutely spot on. You understand.
I think she coined it.
Yeah, probably. But that the responsibility is not the state, it's yours. Responsibilization and devolution.
Yeah.
Right. And she encapsulates what actually is happening. So what you're saying, the responsibilization is what I get concerned with no knowledge of English as well. We suddenly turn it into personal failure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Without looking at the enormous inequalities of teachers in the rural areas. Absolutely. And the quality of the teachers who are available for not any fault of theirs. How were they trained? And then they all sit one standard exam, and other people have brought this up. Others more, more knowledgeable about English language teaching, and they sit the same exam. And if they fail it, it becomes a personal failure. And so that word responsibilization is poor T, it fits it. You feel a personal failure when really the whole system has failed.
It's a system. Yes. Madhu, I started off as an instructor in English at Kelaniya, at the ELTU at Kelaniya. That was my first job. I am Professor Manikumasek's student. I have to say this, right? And I say that with a lot of respect, because she is the one who taught us to see what we have turned English in, the kind of kadua that English really is in this country. So, and she got us to teach while we were students. So we were exposed to a lot of the realities of English language teaching, even though I work in the English department right now. I don't think we are that out of touch with at least in our department, I don't think we are that out of touch with the realities of English language teaching. And we have very rich discussions with our students about this, because our students are the people who will end up becoming lecturers and teachers in our system. It's so my experience, just going back to the 1990s, I experienced this firsthand, where there was a lot of desire on the part of the students to learn English. But there were so many barriers. There were so many, and they were not only tied to resources. They were tied to the fact that there were no English teachers. So, I had many friends in my batch who said, we have never seen an English teacher. There were students who came to university and learned the 26 letters of the alphabet at the university, my friends, right? So these were, the stark inequalities that I had to, and we as, I and my friends in the English department, people who were sensitive to this problem, had to kind of face point blank and recognize that there is this massive inequality and this massive privilege that somehow we have, which sort of then thrusts such a huge responsibility on us.
And Dr. Manuratne, the fact that Sri Lankans can laugh at wrong English is to increase their sense of personal failure. And thereby it is so unfair.
Absolutely. So in my undergraduate dissertation, I was looking at a very simple dissertation by today's standards, of course, but very simply, I was trying to find out why, with all the English and the media and the English, this is what you tell when you're an English teacher, you say, you listen to all these things and you do all these things. You read the books, you will learn the English, right? But I just did a survey, a very simple survey of what was really stopping the students from using English, not learning English, but using English. And overwhelmingly, over and over again, people told me, and they said in their responses, that it was the fear, it was the stigma.
Absolutely.
And I have heard, in those days, very senior English teachers and instructors say, how can we teach these students? These are like, these are like three-wheeler people, right? So there was a
I think the term is Yako. I have heard that
now, yeah. I haven't heard that very much in Kelaniya, but there's a
no. This is not within the university. I think outside.
It's outside. Yeah,
I have heard it many times.
Yeah. So there was. I mean, even within the English classroom, unfortunately, historically, there have been barriers, and there's a distance between the teacher who can speak English and the students who can't speak English, right? There's a huge hierarchy that is constructed, but then we don't recognize it as a social hierarchy that is encroaching into my classroom. I don't realize that when I'm the teacher, right? I think, why can't you read books? Why can't you learn? So this is actually one of the reasons I moved out of language teaching, because I felt like within I couldn't find the answer. It's just purely me. I don't think it was necessarily a limitation of the discipline, but I felt like I needed broader answers than how to teach language properly. Of course, we need the methodology, and I have immense respect for my friends, people like you, who spend so much time and energy. It's very difficult. It's difficult work.
Because
right?
I don't think, Dr. Manuratne, any one of us has figured out a good way of doing it. So one thing I'm doing, so one of the things I'm doing here is by getting people like you to come and talk, or others, to show the complications of it, and maybe not feel so bad about yourself or inferior about yourself when you're within the process, and not to sugarcoat the problem. Yeah, and you need to work.
Absolutely. No, this is why I say, like, I have immense respect for the people who stay on in the profession of language teaching, because it's difficult, and also they are the people who are, the frontline workers of a kind of war that has been going on a long time. I mean, we are as a teacher, when you're teaching language, you're the first going to go and face a child who has never seen an English teacher for 20 years. It's not easy to do that. Right. I mean, it's very difficult. So in that sense,
if we had different policies, Dr. Manuratne, we are again digressing from your article. For example, for a long time, I've been saying, get fun into the nurseries, get English music, get games, get Kung Fu Panda, let them laugh. For some reason, we've connected English with seriousness, like, Tokugahana. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, so that they think this is not theirs. But I have, written proposals where I said, get volunteers to go in there, 15 minutes of a video, a fun video. And I keep saying, stop dubbing cartoons, show the English version.
Exactly.
So, we have the resources. We don't use it properly.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, in the 80s, I belong to the generation that watched Robin Hood subtitled. So you heard the English and you saw the singular words, and the sort of. I mean, I don't come from studied at one of these urban elite schools, but I see myself very much as a first language speaker of Sinhala, not English. So I'm conversant in both languages, and I speak both languages well. But I quite remember watching Robin Hood and reading the subtitles in Sinhala, and which was really it really helped us to learn and improve. And even though I studied in a school that had a lot of English, and I had my teacher spoke English, so it wasn't like I didn't have the privilege. I'm not going to pretend that I didn't. But at the same time, the society around me and my home background was not completely English speaking. So I didn't come from that kind of elite, that is what I'm trying to say. So in that sense, I think you're very right. English, the moment English is turned into grammar exercises and hierarchies and establishing the teacher's authority, it becomes a really terrible way.
And in nursery, Dr. Manuratne, they are kids. They would laugh. They would enjoy it. You know, and I have had people after 13 years of school shiver when you interview them in English, which is like,
no, absolutely.
So there's a lot of things that can be done with the limited resources we have. It's just to see whether people are listening and getting libraries, fun books out there, all that. So anyway, to go back into your article, so responsibilization links it directly to language learning within that framework. And the second thing that Wendy Brown says is devolution. That is beautiful because it ties back to the rich people getting it and the others don't, where you have explained what you have meant by that.
Yeah, so the way I understood devolution in the context of the 81 reforms is the way they were trying to redistribute the power, the decision-making powers that existed in the system. So what happened with devolution was that they created what is called the cluster school system, where now the cluster of schools had to share the resources. But we are talking about very limited resources here, right? And you're obviously talking about one or two schools having a lot of power, a lot of money tied to now also the school development boards that were developed, this Pasal Sangvardhana Samiti. You know, that was when you had to gradually people had to bring their chair and table to school, and somehow.
And you had defined it as quietly putting the responsibility of getting the resources into the people themselves, when it really should have been the state giving it, but they call it, like you say, rhetoric, pretty words, right?
Exactly.
And Dr. Manuratne, did the schools ever work as a cluster? Did they ever share resources?
Yeah. They were implemented somewhere in 84. They were implemented. I don't think it exists now, but it was implemented. It was implemented.
Did schools like Royal College also be part of a cluster? Like, could somebody from another come
they
and
exempted some schools. They exempted some schools, and what this really kind of this system really destroyed was the central school system, the Madhya Mahavidyalaya. That was the backbone of the free education movement, really. That was what was developed.
During my PhD, I researched on 10 writers. You would be surprised how many of them benefited immensely from the Madhya Mahavidyalaya. If you hear Professor Avarakirti's talk, you hear, and Nishtanka Vijayamana, such a positive opening up of another dimension, and to have and very good education. It's not that. So that how did that get affected by the cluster schools?
Well, so what happened was so there was a sort of a system, a kind of a ladder system, where you would have there would be the primary schools, and I mean, it of course is tied to this meritocratic system, but the people who pass the grade 5 scholarship, right, or the brighter students, quote unquote brighter students, would then get into the central college.
That's how it happened.
Right? Which would provide education up to the A levels.
Yes.
So somebody who managed to get into a Madhya Mahavidyalaya had a far greater chance of going to the university than someone who couldn't.
Yes.
Right. So so even to this day, if you take, for example, a school like Amlipitia Center, right? I mean, you think sort of unheard of school, but actually these are very good schools, right? And in those areas, there's a lot of competition to get into these central schools to this day. But as a system, it kind of collapsed because it was no longer for one thing, there was a slashing of resources, right? So the resources put into education, state education was limited, right? This is all nice and good if you pumped money into the system to actually do what they were proposing. This is what I'm thinking now, like, when I was writing this article, and particularly now, I'm thinking at that time, they had, and I think that was a shortcoming of the Kanangara report as well. There is this thinking, right, which I think in some ways is good, but you need a lot of infrastructure to be able to carry out this reform. But without the infrastructure, you try to do the reform, the responsibility falls on the teachers and the parents and the school boards and people who can't make those decisions.
Because they don't have the resources, they don't have the wealth.
They don't have the resources, they don't have the money.
Yeah.
And also, if you look at the larger class system of our society, you can't deny the fact that some people are more powerful than others, whether we like it or not.
Yes.
Right? It's a very hierarchical and very polarized system. So, for example, if you are sort of saying, okay, now all these schools in the cluster have to share the resources, then obviously it's going to go to the schools that have the more powerful, the OBAs or the OGAs, people who can afford
in 2022.
Exactly, right? I mean, you can see this is how anecdotally I have heard this. I don't have evidence, so I don't know if I should say it publicly, but anecdotally I have heard that people promise the principal to build a swimming pool if they will take the child into the school in the central colleges, right, or smaller schools. So why? So we've created a situation in which that type of corruption is necessary, right? On the one hand, you create this crazy competition, this sort of absolutely ridiculous level of competition, and then you also have a system where some people can benefit from it, right, in very corrupt ways.
And some people are always the more wealthy or the more powerful, always.
That's always the case. That is always the case. So this sort of, I mean, it's only after the 80s, it's only after these changes that you had this kind of big cases of bribing school principals, a kind of corruption associated with grade 1 in the 70s. I don't think anybody cared, right? Because there was it's relative. But there was a relative equilibrium in the system because the central school system, people accepted it as a sort of a relatively fair system. I mean, I don't know, I think that there were many problems with it as well, but it worked. It worked for people who could work their way up, at least for those.
And we have now senior professors who have proved the success. Superb writers who could not have been there had it not worked. Right. So
there's an entire class of people who would not have been there if not for that education reform in 43. There's no doubt about that. So I think I completely agree with what you're saying. So I think these were in theory, so even if you look at the reforms they were proposing to the university, it sounds like a kind of circular that would come now, creating an environment conducive to research and emphasizing postgraduate education to place the universities at the top of the education pyramid. There's nothing wrong with that.
I just keep thinking it's just words, and words have become less and less meaningful. Honestly.
Yeah.
So that this is honestly, Dr. Manuratne, like the way words have been used in war, in everything, somehow silence seems so much better. It's just
exactly
they've taken the meaning out of words.
Because these are actually problems. I mean, to this day, when we say that our state education system has failed, nobody stops, or very few people stop to ask, what is it exactly that we have failed at? I mean, I think there are many areas of failure that we need to face, and we need to be honest about those, right? I mean, not just only, I think this job market issue in some ways is the least of our problems. Because if you think about the kind of packaging of soft skills and all, it's very easily done. It's not that difficult. Like when they say, we did this very interesting study so many years ago, somewhere in 2001, just as I finished my degree, on what was it exactly that employers were, this was what we went and asked. What do you mean? We asked private sector employers, what do you mean when you say English? Right? When you say that your employees have to know English, when you recruit people, what do you mean? What do you think they should know? So they always describe the way people carry themselves, the demeanor, the manners. It's not English. It's like the various sort of class behaviors associated with English that we now, call soft skills, right? So like when we say leadership, we are not necessarily looking for true leaders, right? To make true leaders,
we come back to what you said right at the beginning. It's class disguised as many things.
As other things, yeah.
Other
I think that's the main point that I was trying to make.
And we never admit that we are still going around the bush without ever saying, no, not really, or not even looking for English. So, because if a foreigner comes with broken English, he'll be taken in at a glance.
Exactly.
It's quite sad because, see, what I am doing, or, by coming here, you're doing is to make people realize this and have less of a sense of failure, because it's systemic.
Oh, absolutely.
It's systemic and it's not really even individual. Right? And Dr. Manuratne,
it's not, and I think,
I'm sorry, yes, go ahead. No, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I think it's really important to tell our students that, because they need to recognize that they are carrying the burden of a problem that has been historically created. Doesn't mean you don't have to work hard, right? It just means that you probably need to work harder, but you have to recognize that it's not personal. It's not a personal.
Also, hopefully, by having these conversations on YouTube, also the corporate sector might listen and understand their own sometimes unknowing positioning that make, like, we have connected English with intelligence. It's automatic now.
Absolutely.
Things like that. Why? So it's good to bring these into the open, like you have been doing with your writing. So, and also Dr. Manuratne, in this, my Atramadhyava channel, I interview people and who have completely, done PhDs and come to a state on how they learned English.
Right.
Today, like just last night, I was talking to Professor Asanga Tilakaratne, and the enormous amount of hard work that has gone in. It's possible, as you say, maybe they have to work harder, but that is there, and these are people who work within a systemic injustice to somehow make it.
Injustice.
Yes. So you
I mean, it's like when you're a woman. It's like when you're a woman. I mean, you may be just as smart or smarter than the men in the class, but if you're a mother and you're doing, you probably could relate to this. I went through it myself. If you're doing a PhD with a kid, it's not the same thing, right? That there are very structural imbalances that don't allow you to perform in the same way. It's a given, your gender. I mean, when education is racialized, it's the same problem. English in our country is, I have been moving towards the term inclusive education for this reason, because we have to, I mean, a lot of people think of disability, and I think disability is central to inclusive education. But I think we need to also broaden it, to think about the various barriers, social barriers that exist when it comes to studying. And to recognize those as social barriers is not to say, these problems are there, so it's not our fault, what can we do? No, it's the ability to it's you learning enough to understand that, to be critical enough to understand that, and to take it on as a challenge and as an opportunity, because who else can solve this problem? We will have to figure out an answer to this. It will be the speakers, it will be the people who have been deprived, it will have to be the teachers who struggle with these realities every day. English teachers, I mean, in the English department, we don't get the sort of the people who are first language speakers of English anymore. Only, occasionally we get one or two students, but most people are second language speakers of English now. Even in the English departments, it has changed. I think it's a good thing, right? It makes our job harder, but it's a good challenge. It would have been easier to teach Shakespeare to people who knew their English. It's much more difficult to do that to people who don't. But that's the whole point.
In the Delta, I think we even get EFL students, Dr. Manuratne, English as a foreign language. I mean, I know we don't normally call it that.
We don't call them that, but that's what it is,
Because they don't hear the language in a village. Exactly. I started a Bhasha Buddy project, and that's something separate, but there were people who went through a process and said it's a one-to-one texting system where here a group of us who are proficient in English, including my students and my colleagues, text anonymously. People who need help because simply they can't practice. They don't have friends or any acquaintance that knows English. And I have had people in the feedback form saying it's the first time in my life I communicated in English. So I mean, it is obviously a foreign language. No, if you don't have people in rural villages speaking the language. So I sometimes think it's EFL and not ESL to the of them.
Oh, no. I was just going to say, I just a funny story, because all my stuff seems to be very tragic. I mean, feel free to cut this part off if you want to. I don't know if it's
this goes unedited, Dr. Manuratne, straight to the...
It's just this funny thing. One of my American friends came to Sri Lanka, and she's an athlete. Like she runs. So she was jogging on the road, and she came back and she asked, Prabha, why in your country do people say hello and then ask, what is your name? So people had kept asking her, what is your name? So she was very confused about this, and she came and said, why is it that people ask, what is your name in your country? Because she thought it was some cultural thing. And said, I don't know, maybe they liked you. And then my husband, who is from Kurunegala, and he studied in a much more
I can guess the punchline, Dr. Manuratne.
He said, because that's the English they know, and that's what they've been asked in English all the time. What is your name? It's the first thing you learn, right?
I got the punchline before you came. That's exactly what we say first.
Yeah, because that's what you teach people to say. And you see this white woman who's kind of friendly, and but that says a lot about, people are really, ordinary everyday people are not against English, despite everything we say about Kadu and the antipathy towards English. It's there, but it's there's a lot of class jealousy, admitted, but people also want to learn English.
Absolutely. And I think more people who from the side of people who know English, less judgment, less ridicule, less scorn, knowing the systemic injustices that has created this situation. And from those who are learning, less feeling of inferiority, less this responsibilization. They should question and challenge and put out.
Yeah, it should be turned into, it be turned into a way to challenge an unequal. Learning English.
Critical thinking,
thinking,
from your own location.
Yeah, and also a way of challenging a system that tries to deprive you of the one language tool that can, personally also give you more opportunities, but also politically and socially give you so much more.
Yeah, and knowledge-wise, Dr. Manuratne, the simple knowledge that can give you, because
absolutely,
you realize how much, like if you do a PhD from a foreign country, the availability of the books and the vast numbers, you can't even imagine.
Yeah.
going
No,
there
absolutely.
without knowing the language. So you need to equip yourself with that power, kado in the sense of get that power into your hands. It's
Exactly.
possible. So the
Yeah.
stories, if you follow here of Professor Amarakirti, Professor Asanga Tilakaratna, and young people like Kaushalya, like how they have learned, it's, and I like this. I'm sorry, I'm go ahead.
No. I was just going to tell this other story because I think I've never really shared this in public, but I'm going to say this now. I think I'm old
don't
enough.
Dr. Manuratne, I just want to warn you. It goes
That's all right. No, I think I'm old enough now. It's okay to say this. When I first went to university, I was, there's ragging in the university. So I had made up a story. And I had already worked as a journalist for 2 years before I went to university. So I was quite well equipped. I had a lot of privilege behind me. I could deal with it, right? So I made up a story, and then they always stopped me and they asked me, "Tata mukada karani?" I said, "Tata ne." My father passed away when I was very small. Amma mukada karani? My mother worked in a bank, but I never told them what my mother did in the bank. I always said, "Bank ko clerk," which was very safe. And then they asked me, and I'm originally from Mount Lavinia. So I always Gamakoheda Ratmalana. So the only thing the raggers knew was airport. Nagi plane good at the end. I'm like, I know I plane and this is me just like, trying to, weather through the ragging. And then they asked me the school, and I would always say, where's Kumari Vidyalaya, which is not even like an underprivileged school. It's a good school, but they just hadn't heard of it. So then they would get friendly with me because I wouldn't project myself as coming from an English-speaking upper middle class background. So, and I've written about this in my undergraduate dissertation. And invariably, after some time, I would get friendly. I would chat with them. And then one of the questions that I used to get asked very, very often was, Nangi Ubukumutabang English, right? Because for them, the question was, if you don't come from that background, how come you know English? Right. And I think this is why I thought I'd share this with you.
Exactly.
Because it's very, very important to, when you have English, when you have the privilege of English, it's very important to remember that it comes with a lot of responsibility in a country like ours. And if we don't own up to that responsibility, and if we don't recognize how we are privileged and why we are privileged because of the language we speak, then I think that's a real kind of betrayal of what we could become of ourselves, what we could make of ourselves. You talk to a lot of people, Madhu, who have learned English with the greatest difficulty. And in some ways, I think it's really also important for people who speak English. And I'm probably sort of speaking from that angle as someone who didn't have to struggle a lot to learn English. I think the fact that I didn't have to struggle as much places a lot of responsibility on me to think about
Dr. Manuratne, because you're in the campus system, but the majority of English speakers are not within the system. They don't see the pain. Yeah. They don't see the justice. And then most of the perhaps unknown suppression comes exactly from those centers.
Yeah, this is why I always say this, that it's important to tell people, the fact that you speak English already places a burden on you, a responsibility on you to be responsible for the people who have been denied that opportunity. It's not their fault. It's not a personal failure.
Right.
We have both been
saying that ties back to what you're saying. And in your conclusion, you say the key purpose of this article is to see how policy reform and ideology intersected, and how neoliberal thought was grafted onto an already existing class antagonism within education. So that's exactly, where this discussion leads to. Yeah. So I find this article extremely significant, and I wish many, many more people will read it. So when the video goes up, I'll put the link. This is available online.
Online, yes. Yes.
Did you write this in Sinhala also, Professor Dr. Manuratne, or is it only in English?
No, I wrote this in English. I mean, I wrote this essay for about, I think, 1.5 years. I think it's to the credit of the editors of Quality that they managed to turn it into a proper article, really, because I've done so much. I just borrowed, I got a friend to get the 81 reforms, because like I said, it was during the Saitam struggle and I was very active in it. And so I wanted to know, when we are fighting for something, we have to know what we are fighting for. We have to understand what is good about it and what its failures and shortcomings are. So if we say free education, we have to recognize why it's important and what its paradoxes are. We have to be honest about what we are fighting for. So that's, I think, the reason I wanted to, for myself, I wanted to work through this moment. And maybe like just sort of, I know you're trying to wrap up, so I'll just say this quickly. It's also the 80s as a decade. For me, it's a very, very interesting decade. I was a teenager in the 80s, or I became a teenager in the 80s. But I had seen people who were a few years older than me really sort of fighting on the streets, talking about the Patrikam, never really knowing. I don't think many of the people who died in 87, 89 had ever had the opportunity to read this white paper. I mean, it was all what they heard. It just speaks to how much our education system failed many of our people, and it was really a tragedy. So and I still think there were, these are historical moments. It's very difficult to turn back and say they should have done this or they should have, you don't know, that's why you didn't do it, right? I mean, you were working within the
and the young people now, Dr. Manuratne, may not know this history. And now the other schools coming up, with international schools coming up, they might forget what happened before. And sadly, I don't see any what I see right now with international schools and everything is the gap is becoming bigger, not closer.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So it's both ways. So on the one hand, you have like these other outlets, and we haven't talked about it at all, the privatization of school education. I mean, there were always private schools in Sri Lanka, but also the tuition system, the shadow education system, which is not limited to cities and rich people. It's everywhere, right? It's everywhere. I went to Surya last year, and there was a priest and the corona and all, and I asked is only thing I know, right? So I asked his and he said meaning that there were tuition classes were going on, was what he was saying. Wow. Right? So there is, even in far out places, we have created a shadow education system. So that's part of it. And also, Madhu, I have to say this, otherwise I would be fading by the article. It is also written, I mean, I know it's written in English, so I don't know how much it would reach the student movement, but it's very important for the student movement to understand the history of what they are struggling for today. I don't think that our student movement reads enough of its own history, unfortunately. It's really important.
Right. So as someone said, I think it was a writer whose name I won't mention in this context. I hope to speak to him later. He said the left movement hardly documents anything. And that he takes as a failure. How come? I mean, why don't they write? Where are the books? Yeah. So, this, I can ask you, why didn't you translate this, Dr. Manuratne? You're bilingual. Absolutely.
I think for me personally, I mean, it's very difficult once I write something. For years, I don't read. Actually, I read this after it was published for the first time to have this conversation. It's very difficult for me to return to my own writing.
When we talk in Sinhala, I think one of the discussions we had prior to this recorded interview was how do you translate responsibilization? So we'll come to this, because I'm glad I will have a chance to talk to you in Sinhala, because that might cover the lacuna that this being published only in English has created. And I do hope somebody will translate this, because it
Yeah,
needs.
and I have also incorporated a lot of the arguments that I make, because I'm also very publicly active. I speak a lot, even though I don't write a lot. So
Yes.
I feel like I mean, this is the basis of some of the speeches that I made on education at the time,
Okay.
because written, so it's not good.
I will, after thanking you profusely for your time, and with the power cuts, which again, all of us are staying up nights, and at least
Yeah.
all of us. And the professor yesterday was, very senior, but he still stayed up, because I think all of us realize right now
No,
the
this is
power
important.
education has in getting it out. So thank you very much, Dr. Manuratne. I will talk to you again in Sinhala, and maybe we can
Yes.
cover like many things which needs to be discussed in our mother tongue, and hopefully even in Tamil, because it concerns everyone. I find this a very significant article, and I've used it in my own
Thank you.
doctoral studies. I hope it gets translated both into Sinhala and Tamil very soon.
Madhu, I want to thank you, not only for having me in your channel, and I really thank you for when you addressed it for me, how carefully you have read the article. It's one reason that I think I never returned to this was because I didn't, when you write, this happens to you, when it's your own work, you don't necessarily recognize the importance of it. But when you read it back to me, I was thinking, oh yeah, that's really interesting when you put it like that. When somebody else says it,
Yes.
it sounds interesting and important. So I want to thank you for really sort of recognizing an article, not recognizing, but recognizing what an article like this could do, especially in the context of language education and discussions of education policy. So thank you very much. It's really, it was a very enjoyable conversation.
Thank you so much. No, it's like you watch what's happening now, Dr. Manuratne. This is more significant than anything else. I see resources being given to places that already have it. And you know of the absolute, because of my location in the campus, the absolute lack of resources of people who come in, and the courage of them to have come in somehow. So this is very, very, and I really hope you'll, or someone is going to translate this into Sinhala and Tamil, but we'll meet again to talk about this in Sinhala. So thank you very much, Dr. Manuratne.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Right.